For more on African fashion on the global stage, I spoke to Zarinah El-Amin Naeem, global citizen mentor and founder of Enliven Your Soul. And I started by asking her whether more needs to be done to bring African fashion into the limelight.
I think that right now we are finding that people are really connecting to the diaspora in many different ways. We have had this summer a blockbuster hit, Black Panther coming out, and that really sparked a bigger interest in African fashion. But what I find is very interesting is that the meanings of the underlying reasonings of why people wear particular fabrics or how certain fabrics are made are not oftentimes translated into this big resurgence and interesting history or interest into fashion.
So what do you think needs to happen then so that people can perhaps connect in a more meaningful way with the clothes that they're wearing? What's needed to get more African designers and their message in their clothing into the mainstream retailers?
I think that one of the things is for people to be able to see some of the designs and who's actually making the designs. Like the fabric that I have on right now was created by an artist. So an artist sat down, drew out this painting, and then color, and all of that went into the creation of the fabric. I think that if we tell the story of the origins of how the clothing comes about, I think that it can really build up a lot more understanding and a lot more interest into the backstory.
Now let's also look at the influence on African fashion. We know that there's been a lot of Western influence just culturally and through history on the African continent. Is that something that we can expect to see influence the fashion that comes out of Africa?
I think absolutely. I mean, everything right now is interconnected. You have fabrics coming from different places, the designs are coming from different places, and everything is sort of merging together. And I think that it only makes sense that while Africa is influencing the fashion in other parts of the world, that the Western world and other parts are also going to influence the way that African fashion is done. And so right now you're seeing a lot of the traditional clothing and cotton fabrics being used, but they're putting it into blazers or into some like a funky little poplin skirt or such. And so the styles are being influenced by what we're seeing in the broader world. So I think it's going to go a lot of ways back and forth.
Now let's look at the business model. We know that a lot of African fashion is produced within the continent. What are some of the benefits and the challenges that comes with?
Wow, I think I worked in Sierra Leone and I also worked in Senegal. And one of the beautiful things about those two countries, Sierra Leone in particular, is that the land is so fertile, right? You can literally grow anything. So the cotton industries of many parts of Africa could flourish just by way of the land. But with that comes a lot of consideration that has to go into the production side, making sure that the quality is always even. And you have to make sure that people are sort of kept in the know of how to keep the production going on a timely way, and all of those things that go into making sure that the orders get filled when they need to be filled. So I think that there are some complexities that go into making sure the production happens, but I think that Africa is ripe for it. It makes absolute sense that Africa becomes a major production center for fashion, not only for African fashion, but for fashion in general.
What about the actual economic benefits within the continent when it comes to African fashion? We know that sometimes perhaps a lot of these tailors don't get to see, by the time these things get exported, some of these marked up prices. What sort of benefit are the tailors themselves getting in all this?
I think we have to be considerate about fair trade. We have to make sure that the people who are producing the work have a fair wage. That only makes sense, right? And so we can't continue to exploit a people because we love the fashion. It's like, oh, that's really cute, I'm just going to purchase it, and not also think about who actually made it and what went into it. And so I think that there is a lot of room for economic development and equity to come through the fashion. But I think that we as consumers as well must demand that people within the fashion industry have a fair trade with it.
One issue that tends to come up when it comes to fashion from another culture is cultural appropriation. There is this line between appreciating and appropriating. How do African designers navigate that when they're really trying to get their products out to perhaps a mass consumer audience?
I think that you're right. It is a fine line. And as a woman who wears clothing from all over the world, from Japanese kimonos to Indonesian fabrics, I think that what has to happen is that people need to understand, again, the chain of creation within the fashion, right? And so if you have a big designer that's coming in and taking the work of a local artist, a fabric designer, a textile maker, and not creating the fair distribution of funds, then that's a problem. If you have people's cultural currency being taken without people understanding what the history of this fabric is, or how this fabric came to be, or where it was traditionally used, all of those things, I believe that that's a problem. So I think that a lot of education has to come into it, and also a fair distribution of the resources.
Now, a really great platform is obviously Fashion Week, something that everyone in the fashion industry is familiar with. And Africa has its own fashion industry events. You have Dakar Fashion Week, Cape Town Fashion Week. Is there space on those platforms to really transition that also to really make a big impact on some of these Western fashion weeks?
Oh, absolutely. But we're already seeing it, right? We're seeing the influence of Africa within New York Fashion Week and with many designers. And so one of the things goes back to, though, as you mentioned, to the cultural appropriation or appreciation. What we're finding is that sometimes when people are utilizing African fashion and African traditions, the kudos or the thanks is not given. And so it seems almost as if it's something novel or something new or they created it. And so you can't do that. You can't take someone's cultural currency without giving appreciation to where it comes from. But we're already seeing a lot of influence from Africa into New York Fashion Week and London Fashion Week, so it's already happening.
And let's also get your outlook on where the African fashion industry is heading. We know that sustainability is a really big issue when it comes to perhaps greener production methods. We're also looking at working conditions, introducing technology. Where do you see Africa's fashion industry heading?
I think that the future for African fashion is really bright. And I look at countries like Rwanda, where the president is sort of outlawing all of the secondhand clothing coming from many of the countries of the West. And some people say, well, this is a really big problem for tariffs and all of that. But I see it as a way to build up a resurgence of the interest into traditional clothing. And so I think that countries like Rwanda and other countries who are sort of pulling out the traditional clothing and saying, this is not just for a wedding or for a special occasion, but these are our clothes. This is our identity. This is our way of showing who we are outward to the world. I think that is growing, and I think that it's going to be an absolute beautiful way for not only the farmers and those who are producing the cotton, but the artists as well as the designers to really build a beautiful African fashion industry.